All right, so everybody, welcome to the show. This is our presentation about how 40 years of product outsourcing, corporate acquisition, so M&A, and bad spelling, yes, that is on purpose, leaves OT security flaws in all of your products. And by the way, if you're a controls engineer, you'll definitely know how spelling mistakes will ruin your day for the rest of that deployment's lifetime. So here is your speakers today. So I'm Ron Brash. I'm the director and researcher at Verve Industrial Protection. And my compadre and former boss is Eric Byers here, CEO of aDolus and Technology Inc.
Thanks very much, Ron. It's a real pleasure to be here. Some of you guys probably remember me from the Tofino days when I ran and put together Tofino, but now I'm focusing on supply chain problems as the CEO of aDolus. So it's great to be working with Ron and the team at Verve. Ron, let's start the show.
Great. So I'll do a quick agenda here, recap. So we're going to do a really quick one-pager on a level set of OT versus IT. This isn't a 101 course, but this is just to put a few facts in front of you why this is a different beast. We're going to define what vulnerabilities are because there's about 50 different flavors depending on which industry you happen to be in. We'll talk about some of the acronyms that are used in advisories about those vulnerabilities and how you can kind of apply a bit of a rote learning strategy to that. We'll talk about the challenges in advisory reporting, and then some of those are going to be humanly possible as long as you have enough bodies to throw at keyboards, and then some are going to require other mechanisms, which is why we're here today. Then we'll talk briefly about how SBOMs are to be used as a security tool to help, get all those facts in one place. But then, where else do you need to go after the fact? Like an SBOM isn't the end of the end game. Eric's going to do an aDolus fact demo, and I'm going to try to do a demo with the Verve reporting platform. At the moment, we're having some VPN issues with our lab in Wisconsin, so I'm not too sure what's going on there. But we will do a bit. I'll do at least an offline version of the presentation, and I will gladly schedule a follow up if anyone wishes a live one. And then we'll end it with a couple key takeaways, and then we'll open the floor for questions. And we already have a good list of questions that already came in, but we'll happy to answer everybody in the audiences. So OT is a different beast, as I was saying. The short of the matter is OT is what matters, or what matters in OT is keeping the lights on and the water flowing, or keeping the oil coming out of the ground and keeping the feedstock operating properly in a refinery. So the reality of all this is to manage OT systems, you're really managing risk. So step one is to know your assets in the field and what they're actually doing. Step two is to know where they're weak, so they're vulnerabilities. And these aren't just the cyber CVE type ones necessarily, but it's vulnerabilities in general. And then your third step would be to prioritize the remediation. Now, prioritizing the remediation is a whole nother story altogether, and I could probably do about 5 or 6 different webinars on that subject, but we're focusing just on step 2 today. Now, a couple of fun facts here is from all of our Verve's experience and even probably Eric's in the field, when you really look at the numbers of embedded and OT assets, for every Windows box, you probably have 3 or 5 more embedded systems on the other side of it. So if you took a reasonably sized facility, nothing too extreme, but a reasonably sized one where you're looking at, let's say, 1,300 assets or so, well, probably only 100, maybe 150 of those are Windows commodity assets. That's just looking at that alone. So there's a magnitude greater of embedded assets and assets that are providing connectivity, and that's just one plant. But what happens if you're in a distributed environment where you have RTUs and you have LTE gateways and stuff like that? The other thing that is very interesting fact is when you take the average age of an industrial product, it looks like it might be new. It might have gone through a few era changes. But the average kernel, the operating system inside of it, is probably 8 to 10 years old on average, if not older in many cases. So that's a big surprise for many people when they think they're getting a brand new product. It's because they've worked out the bugs and all the other ones. There's a reason why some people still like Windows NT, for example. It's because of that. It was a simpler time, I guess. The other interesting thing is from Eric's and I's previous life is when you look at the amount of protocols talking to all these devices, and this is just an idea to give you an idea, or a sample to give you an idea of how many components might be in something or how long they might live or stuff like that. There's over 450 different industrial control systems protocols, and probably 99.9% of them were unsecure and will continue to do so for the next decades to come. So what is a vulnerability? And depending on where you happen to sit, this is going to look very, very different. But this is how Eric and I like to define it. It is a flaw, a poor design choice, or an incomplete configuration of a product or software that leads to negative conditions. So for example, if you're a very mechanical person, a front wheel drive car is terrible in the snow. So that's its vulnerability. If you're, for example, if you're running an older operating system and it happens to have telnet in it, and that telnet could be misused, it's not a vulnerability per se, but it is a vulnerability that can be misused. And so you need to look at things a little bit differently. Now, when everyone thinks of an advisory, I don't expect everyone, including asset owners, to be cybersecurity pros. But this is the short form of what an advisory is, and there's kind of the main 4 components inside of it. So ideally, an advisory is a vulnerability disclosure that contains 1 or more CVE records. And each record has a Cvss score, or some sort of a risk metric. It'll have the identifier, and then it will also have a CPE. It should also have a CWE as well, but nonetheless, here's how it works. And this is a bit chicken before the egg because we're going to start getting towards the challenges. We're just setting the ground here. CVE is just an identifier, so you'll often will see it as CVE dash whatever, and a unique ID. It's just an identifier to find that flaw and to track it, to assign it to an asset that may or may not have it. Then you have a Cvss Score. Now this is just a score. It's between 0 and 10 if you're looking at the newer revisions of it. And it's a metric to decide unfettered impact and criticality if that flaw is exploited. So what that means is if you're disclosing a vulnerability, zero compensating measures are accounted in that score. It could be actually an 8 or a 6 or a 4, but on paper it's going to be a 10, and that's very, very hard to discern from an end user's point of view. But it is a score and it's a metric to be used. Then you have what's called a CWE, a common weakness enumeration. This is merely just a label that describes and classifies the nature of a flaw at a very high level. I try to tell people, don't get caught up in the bits and bytes. I don't expect anyone to ever know what a path traversal is. But if you do understand how to kind of group those together, a path traversal or buffer overflow typically means someone did a poor job writing code. So you just kind of classify all that into a software engineering mistake category, and you'll have a way better day at the end, trust me. And then you have a CPE, and this is where this starts to get tricky. A CPE is basically a vector. A vector means that you have a bunch of values and you can use that to find the CVE. Now, often CVEs don't have a CPE, or they have a CPE that is irrelevant, and so you can't actually find each other. So that's where the problems start to come in. But nonetheless, there's this well-defined system. It, in theory, will work well, but we're starting to get some tatters at the edge. So in addition to all of that, what we did in 2020, we took a very in-depth review of all of the vulnerabilities that were disclosed on ICS CERT, and those would be vulnerabilities inside of advisories. All this looks great, right? We have a bunch of classifications of the vulnerabilities, and if you notice, 58% of them, of the vulnerabilities were actually related to poor software engineering practices, or well, not maybe by the OEM itself, but by something that they've included in their products. And then if we kind of look in this, and everyone says, and this is a common issue that we find in the field, is everyone says, I'm just going to focus on the Windows boxes because that's where all the attackers get in. Well, part of that's true, definitely, don't get me wrong. But when you look at the split, it's almost an even split between embedded and software. And interestingly enough, over 2019 and 2020, so the obvious supply chain related vulnerabilities were roughly equal. But Eric and I know that to be very, very not true, and a very fallacy, because almost nobody makes their own operating system from scratch. Almost nobody will go make a SSH tunnel by themselves. They're using other components. So you really need to consider that supply chain number is probably far greater in terms of the embedded software, and we're not counting the vulnerabilities that are being included in there. People are just tagging them to the product that's affected because they're doing so for various reasons. But everything looks great, right? So if we're looking kind of at this, and from an end user perspective, right, I'm putting myself into the shoes of just an average risk management personnel. And okay, we have advisories, and this one's for Flexera. So for those of you that know what Flexera is, it's the software that generally bundles all of your installers up for all of your packages. That could be for your HMIs, it could be for your server applications. Microsoft doesn't quite use it usually, but everybody else in the industry does. So let's say I saw this advisory. It's relatively recent. It's from 2020, 2020. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, Flexera, okay, there's this thing here. Okay, it looks like it might be a bit of an issue. It says it's integrated into many products and sold by other vendors. Well, my first question is, what other vendors, and am I affected? But I'll bite. Okay, and then it says about the CWE, untrusted search path. I still have no idea what that is, but I would like to continue down that path. Then I have mitigations. Contact the product's vendor support team. I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. Do I actually have a product? Am I wasting my time? Am I, chasing tickets for no reason? But I'll still go down this path because ICS cert said so. Okay, well, let's say I dug into the NVD entry for that CV, and luckily in this case it actually matches. It's not reserved, and so let's look at it. Okay, so we have a score. The score is a medium high. Okay, well I can deal with that. But what's this vector score? That means nothing to me. Okay, fine. I'll skip that. I just need to know if I have a problem. Okay, well I still have a problem. There's no vendors that are affected. Just for the original vendor by itself. That's not very helpful at all to me. Okay, well, all right. Well, I guess I might call the vendor, or I'm going to go after the one that's in the recent media, which might be a Trek stack vulnerability or Urgent 11, because at least my board is aware of that and they're yelling at me. But I also have all of these other fields, and each vendor has their own OEM portal, which might have differing information from ICS cert. They're definitely going to be different than NVD, and Eric and I are going to show you why that's a problematic solution, problematic method altogether. But if I look at that, ABB has one, Schneider Electric has one, Yokogawa has one, Rockwell has one, GE has some behind hidden doors, same with Emerson. So at the end of the day, I mean, all this looks like it's humanly feasible, minus the gaps in mapping the technologies. But this is going to consume a lot of my time. And imagine if I had 5 or 6 different vendors and I had products that have been implemented over 20 years. This is going to look really, really difficult.
Okay, Ron. All right, Ron's going to make me the host now, and I'm going to do a little chatting. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. And everybody see that? You can see the screen out there, Ron?
Yep, you're good to go.
Great. Okay, good. All right. So now what I want to move on to is Ron brought up some really, really interesting problems here, because we've got all these different databases going on. We've got the ICS cert database, we've got the National Vulnerability Database, and then we've got every vendor with its own database. And what we'll see is there's very poor correlation. One of the things that we discovered quite quickly was that most vendors don't actually map back into the National Vulnerability CVE database. In fact, one major vendor we looked at, 46% of their vulnerabilities had no listed CVE. So mapping back and forth, or if you're trying to do your vulnerability analysis by simply looking at the CVE list, you're not going to find half of the vulnerabilities that are related to this OT vendor. Similarity, if you're trying to look at this vendor, you're not going to have mechanisms to be able to actually track them back and to understand those vulnerabilities. So this is a big problem. But let's just put this one to the side for a second, and let's just look at something where it is in the CVE. So say we want to search, and this is my PLC, and I want to use the common platform enumeration. Again, as Ron mentioned, what that is that's a reference from vulnerabilities to product. Okay, and so I know this GFNUC product right here. It's a PLC. A lot of you guys out there have probably used this PLC. It's the RX3i made by GFNUC. And so I want to go and search for CPE to see if there's any vulnerabilities against it. This seems like a pretty straightforward thing to do. Okay, all right, it's called GFNUC, but here's where it gets a little messy. If you look at the history of GFNUC, of course, it started originally with General Electric. And in our analysis of General Electric files, we see lots and lots of different product names. And of course, you can't just go and throw these into the CPE database, or you're going to be just hunting forever. But of course, they joined with FNUC, and we got lots of FNUC names. So chances are it would be called this product. I should be doing a CPE search for something like GFNUC. But these are all the different names that we're seeing. We find hundreds of different names for the product. So which one should I use? Well, it gets a little messy. It actually got renamed into GFNUC Intelligent Platforms. And then FNUC got cut out of the deal and they went off to look after their CNC machines. And the whole mess got renamed again into GE Intelligent Platforms. And again, these are the product names you'll see when you're looking on the side of the PLC, depending on your version. So you can go and hunt these down, but again, you're going to have a search problem from hell at this point. It gets a little messier. At this point, they go by Alstrom, and now they change the name again. and now it's GE automation controls. So should I be searching the CPE for GE automation controls? Should I be searching for GE FNUC? Well, we can keep going. Of course, Emerson went and bought this division off GE a little while ago. And so now maybe I should be searching for Emerson Electric. So that's, life is in the industrial controls world. It's about mergers and acquisitions and name changes. And that's just one product. I've been around this game for a long time, so I happen to know that one. I'd know to search for all this, and that's exactly what I did. Now, again, if I was a technician and I was trying to figure out if I've got vulnerabilities for my PLC, I'd use the name on the nameplate. Well, I tried that. I started out with GE. That's a bad idea. Don't search the CPE database and National Vulnerability Database with the word GE. I got over 130,000 matching records, and I think I'm almost shut them down. And I definitely had to go away for coffee for a while. So 130,000 records is impossible to scan, so forget that. So then I thought, well, look, I got to narrow it down a little bit. So I put in GE FNUC. I tried GE _ FNUC. I tried GE - FNUC. I tried FNUC GE. I tried all the things that were on the front of that PLC. I got one matching record that says there was a vulnerability, but it was for simplicity in HMI. That's on our PLC. Okay, well, I thought, well, maybe they registered this vulnerability when the name had changed again. So I tried GE Intelligent. Bad move. 314 records. I found a few GE records, GE Intelligent platforms, the Prophecy product, nothing to do with a PLC. Mostly I found Cisco stuff, actually. So I kept trying. I tried, well, the next name it became was GE Automation. No luck here. Lots and lots of automation products, almost 500. So at this point, I tried Emerson and I got a hit. So as you can see, at this point, I have, in order to find the CVEs related to my PLC, it took me about an hour to make these screenshots and do all this hunting to finally get a hit. I tried the same with the product names, doing searches for the name of this product. I got some success with RX3i. It missed one vulnerability set that I knew existed. I tried the other names like the PAC systems, the IC6995, which is the model number on these PLCs. I tried all this, no hits. So my point here is that if you think you can go search the National Vulnerability Database for your product, you'd better have a lot of time and get a lot of false hits. It's not really functional as a human search system. But we could always go to the National Vulnerability Data, or sorry, the ICS cert advisories, and well, we know that we should find vulnerabilities under the name Emerson, right? Well, I did that. I did an Emerson search, nothing. For reasons not clear to me, they're all registered against GE. There's one here that you can see that was registered, one set of vulnerabilities that are registered here. There's actually another set of vulnerabilities down here that the naming is wrong. Whoops, there you go. It is actually missing the RX3i, even though this vulnerability does affect it. So again, any of these vulnerability searches, you are more than likely to say, oh, I tried Emerson, I know Emerson, and walk away thinking you didn't get a hit. There's no way to know that you've actually searched for vulnerabilities for your product. Same if you want to go to the vendors, you're going to have to search multiple vendors' databases if you're going to find the vulnerabilities associated with this PLC. Now, there's nothing wrong with GE, and there's nothing wrong with FNUC, and there's nothing wrong with this PLC. That's not the point. This is just one example of reality in the ICS world and the adds, moves, and changes, acquisitions, mergers, etc., over the last 40 years. The second problem that we run into is that, as Ron pointed out about that flex era, the vast majority of the CPE, CVE listings reference only a component like Flexera and don't actually reference the products at risk. And this is a huge problem unless you happen to know that your vendor used a particular subcomponent like Flexera. You're absolutely out of luck finding vulnerabilities for it. Now there's a way around this, and this is called the software bill of materials. And if you've been following the whole debate since the whole SolarWinds catastrophe, you'll know that software bill of materials really are probably our only way out of jail. They're not perfect, but what is a software bill of materials? It's basically a recipe list or an ingredients list of what are the components in a product. So you see on the side here, here's a very small part of an SBOM for G prophecy. And you can see it's basically just a breakdown of the software components in it. There's a number of standardized formats, SPDX and CycloneDX and SWID are common ones. The very important thing about this is an ingredients list, right? Well, the important thing is it's not good enough to have a list of ingredients. You have to know what their characteristics are. You have to understand it. Think about going and looking at the ingredients list on the side of some food you're going to buy, say some soup you're going to buy in the grocery store. And you look down this list and it has all these names. Some of them you recognize the word, some of them you don't, some of them are chemical names. That is actually pretty useless just to have that list unless you know that palm oil is not particularly good for you. And then you'll see that in the ingredients list and you'll be able to say, oh, I don't want to buy that soup, or that is going to pose a risk to me. Well, the same thing applies here. Your SBOM needs enrichment. It's one thing to have the list. The second thing is to make it usable, is to be able to give information about all those components, and particularly vulnerability information. So at this point, I'm going to show you how we do that using modern machine learning and graph database techniques. And I'm going to give a little demo here. So let's cut over to the demo. And so here, this is what you're looking at as fact. Verve is actually using the API to make these calls, and you'll see what they can do with it. It's much, much more powerful. But I want to show you sort of under the covers what Verve is doing for you using the platform, the fact platform. So first of all, let's say we've got a file of interest. I'm going to do a quick scan here of an ABB file, for example. I'm just going to submit this file. So just to give you some background on this ABB file, this is a protection relay management file. I'm going to submit it into the database. This is going to be a quick analysis. I picked one deliberately that'll go quite quickly because we're doing a demo. Sometimes a full analysis can take half an hour or an hour because there's a lot going on here. It's basically tearing down that entire package and building a software bill of materials and then going out hunting. Okay, there we go. Here we are. And now we can look at this. And so this is where the fun starts. Okay, we can go in here. There'll be lots and lots of file details that we've been able to determine by tearing it down. Right off the bat, we can see that this is a product that was generated by ABB. We're only doing this by file analysis, by the way. We can go in, we can look at a bunch of different names that are actually found inside the file. And this is kind of fun because, again, should I be searching, if I was manually going out and looking in the National Vulnerability Database, which of these names should I be using? But more important, here, let's go look at some subcomponents here. Who are subcomponent suppliers? And here's a list of subcomponent suppliers. Notice this one called SafeNet. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Okay, that guy right there. So that's a subcomponent supplier to this that's embedded in here. All right. But I'm going to actually escape out of here. I'm just going to go over to the files and I'm going to go and look. I want to show you just exactly what's going on behind the scenes here with this file. It's being broken down into all those components as I'm talking here, so that I can make sure, so that we can do all those lookups going back in. So let's see here. Let's have a quick look here. We can see here's Microsoft components, SafeNet components, HAS, OSM, Windows installer components. We're looking at that software bill of materials in a graphic form. By the way, they don't always show up in graphic form. Here's another software bill of materials as well. Sometimes they show up strictly as a this is what we call the SPDX format, but it's almost unreadable for humans. But anyway, so here's a visual breakdown. That's really good for machine readable applications. We can dig through here, but we've actually just shortcutted this whole thing. And we can go over here and we can see there's no vulnerabilities. We'll go in and look here. And we can see that product there called HASP-LSM has vulnerabilities against it. And if we dig into HASP-LSM, we'll really quickly see that, hey, that particular product is not an ABB product. It's a SafeNet product. And so we've had to search the national vulnerability using SafeNet and other names in order to actually find this vulnerability and then associate it. So very, very important here. The other thing that happens here is once we start to build those relationships, we can see other products that have those same SafeNet components. So what is the vulnerability? Okay, all right, let's go look at that SafeNet vulnerability, go find out what it is. And this is where it's kind of fun. We're going to go out to the National Vulnerability Database. Trying to do this manually would have been hopeless. There is no mention of ABB, even though this is an ABB product, in this. Absolutely no mention of ABB. So you could go hunt the CPE list. You could manually search. It's only because we were able to build that SBOM that we were able to associate it back. So this is really important to understand. And that's really what you'll see Verve really taking advantage of in a few minutes on when they see an asset that you have, they can go out, request the SBOM, and then request all the links for the products in the SBOM back to the National Vulnerability Database. Show you one more quick example here. I'll stop picking on poor ABB. I'm going to pick a different vendor. Again, nothing wrong with these vendors. I want to be clear. I'm just using them poor guys as example. Actually, I'm going to pick on a different one. I'm going to pick on some company that we use a lot, or who's a partner, big partner to us, is OSIsoft. They use this tool to build the SBOMs for their customers. And that's what we really encourage, is that it's probably best if the vendors themselves build the SBOMs and supply them to the customers. And that's exactly what OSI does. They use our tools in order to build SBOMs for all their products and do that analysis on behalf of their customers. And that's absolutely the right way to do this. So by all means, tell your vendors to start supplying you SBOMs and we'll help them do it. But here's a tool, here's a product right here from OSIsoft that's kind of interesting. We can break it down and look at its entire tree here. And we can try and figure out all the vendors. We can do that manually by hunting it. Or much faster and funner is to go in here, go into file details, and go in and see and this will take a second. Again, there's some pretty heavy lifting going on, as you'll see in a second. Okay, what are the subcomponents in here that are included in this package? And this is super helpful to the vendors themselves because they may know all the suppliers they deal with directly, but they don't know the suppliers and the suppliers to suppliers to suppliers. So this shows you a list here of all the different components that we found in here. Some of these, this is using machine learning, so some of these are incorrect and you have to tune them up, but it's absolutely a great way to be able to narrow down and say, hey, do I have Microsoft components? Yes. What are the components? And do they have any vulnerabilities against them? As it turns out, this one does not. But over here, I'll show you an example of something that is a vulnerability for this poor package. And that is IC sharp code right here. That is a known vulnerability. You can see it's been given a low score. We can dig into it. We can go and find it. We can see that there's vulnerabilities associated with it. Right now, there's one vulnerability associated to it. I can dig in and have a look at that vulnerability. I can see that there it is. I can go to the CVE. So all that information is available. And again, you don't have to do it. That's the long way to get there. Fast way is just click here, look at the known vulnerabilities for the overall package, and it will tell you that, whoops, there we go. it will tell you that this package contains subcomponents right there. There's the subcomponent. So basically, what we're trying to do is roll up all that information so you don't manually have to go hunt through the SBOMs and the CVE list. It's all packaged in one spot for you. Or if you're using Verve, which I hope you are, for Verve to support for your assets. You can notice that we've actually found a bunch of other vulnerabilities by doing this that we believe are high probability vulnerabilities because of these subcomponents that we're discovering. So I think I'll pass it over. We could go on forever. I've got some other real fun ones here. I could pick on just about every vendor out there because every vendor has to use subcomponents. They have to use third-party suppliers. Nobody can roll their own crypto. Nobody can roll their own protocol stacks. It's just too inefficient. So there's always subcomponents. And the only way we can get a handle on those vulnerabilities in those subcomponents is through building SBOMs and using machine learning techniques to then mine the national vulnerability databases, the vendor databases, and all the other databases. So at this point, I'm going to throw this back over to Ron. And I'll let Ron take over from here and make him the host. And Ron, it's all yours. Ron's on mute for a second there, so we'll get Ron off mute. Good stuff.
Great. So I really apologize. This was meant to be a live demo, but unfortunately the internet is down in the lab and I don't want to keep you waiting. So there's a couple instances here on discussing this, and there's two ways to look at this. So Eric showed you the nice and pretty happy path, right? You can click and drill down. It's human readable, actually even human usable. And then if you had to look at all this data, you might go blind. And I don't recommend that. I mean, I've seen some very, very large update cycles for facilities, and they try to keep those to a minimum for a reason. Now, one of the things there is how do you interact with that from an asset vendor side, right? Like, let's say OSIsoft did build you an SBOM. How would I use that? I mean, I'm just Joe Blow user, or a Jane perhaps. Well, I like to look at things a little bit differently, right? Verve is not just a product company, we're a services company too. We do both of those things to make sure that our customers literally keep the lights on. But if you're looking from NERC or a legislative perspective, NERC is really, really heavy duty in terms of the overhead required, the amount of effort you need to put into it. I mean, if I wanted, if I'm short on resources, I want to save that $100,000 to go hire one or 1.5 persons, right? So I got to look at other aspects here. And the last thing I also want to do is to deal with the MOC, the management of change procedures, and all of those type of gates that I need to get through before you can even get software getting close to being installed inside of a scheduled period of downtime, right? You just don't go apply patches to a turbine while it's running or an X facility. So what you got to think about is this, and I quote this statistic from an industry friend, Megan Samford found it somewhere, but she said, $1 up front in planning will save you $4 later, and NERC is no exception to this rule if you think of what your human resource times are what it costs. So what we did here was, there's multiple ways to do this, but generally most energy production facilities are quote unquote air gapped, or they have data diodes, or you don't just go run stuff inside of them and pull it back into your environments. You might want to do that out of band, for example, on an IT section of a DMZ or in the corporate network. So what you can do is you could say, okay, well, here we have 4 example installers, and I used a couple that Eric were using, and you put them in a folder. You could run a simple PowerShell script against it, and that would call Eric's API, and you'd have your own designated keys and so on. And then you can get a very nice version of a mini SBOM, right, and an aDolus enhanced one if it were. And so you can get all that evidence ahead of time as something to support your MOC process. Now, it does require a bit of knowledge. That's why we went into the discussing what advisories are and stuff like that. But what this can do for you is an idea to give you a way to reduce your efforts and focus on things that matter. So instead of installing software, because you only knew what was, the vulnerabilities that were public, if there were any at all noted, you'd say, whoa, everything looks great. Well, actually, maybe extra information would come out later, or when you went to install it and you did a vulnerability scan on it, poof, those 4 packages became 100 vulnerabilities, and you're not going to be very happy with life. So that's a way to reduce your efforts ahead of time to make room for the efforts that you really need to be focusing on. The other way to look at that is it also can give you clarity on certain things. So if you take many rebranded or rebadged products in the industry, which is very true, right? You'll see Aruba switches in a Siemens catalog. You'll see you'll see Catalyst under a different name under the Rockwell catalog as a Stratix switch. Well, in this case, because of what Eric's done, is we can map back the Cisco iOS versions that are in that product and put that into a some sort of a mutual relationship with that Stratix device. And now I know all of the other things I didn't know before. Now, bit and byte for byte, they're not necessarily the same, but the chances are, and I would say that with high confidence, that many things are likely to be there. They might be configured and disabled outwards, but they will be there. And I'm not picking on any particular vendor. Like Eric said, we work with all of them, and we have friends working at all those companies. But Eric and I came from a background where we built products, and this is the reality. So I'm going to give you another blast from the past. So if you remember from, what is that, June-ish 2020, there was the Trek Ripple 20 big branded vulnerabilities. And I call them branded because certain researchers did this to promote their own companies. And they caused a big storm because of the FUD around it. Now, if you looked at the big mass of 20 vulnerabilities or so, and I just chose Rockwell in this case for various reasons, right? So if I had access behind, it's not a paywall, but it is an account walled portal, right? I'd have to have an account, log into it. I would see, oh, wow, well, how many of these products are affected by Rockwell? And if I'm in discrete manufacturing, chances are I have a lot of these things. But I want to know, right? So I look and I download this and I PDF'd it just to chop it up. Okay, I have all these Trek vulnerabilities. So look, there's 20 there. There's the whole family. I have all the products, the versions affected. And if you notice, and this is another problem, not necessarily a problem, but a nuance to the CVE type system, is it's actually a matrix. It's a series of X's and O's, and some apply and some don't. And actually, the scores that you will see for the real Trek vulnerabilities will be different than the ones that are actually in the actual vulnerabilities as disclosed by the OEM who builds the product. They know best. Well, maybe not supposedly, but more or less they know best. Now, if I dive back a little bit, right, I wanted to see a few things. So I took a look at, and I wanted to go back because if I went on to NVD or onto ICS Cert, I would see something like this. The CPEs would say, hey, this is Trek. Okay, well, we're right back to the FlexEra problem all over again, and this is an embedded industrial devices. Well, there's other ways for people like Eric and aDolus and even myself to unpack firmware and figure this out. We can make guesstimations to see if something is there. For example, digging out strings or looking for symbol tables and stuff like that. But looking at this one, right, I'm just looking at this particular section of X's on the right for CVE 2020 11914. If I cross-link the two, you'll notice that there is no Rockwell match here. There is no power monitor being matched. And so if I had these devices in my facilities, I would never find them. Nobody would ever find them unless you put in some manual magic to figure that out. So again, I would have done a demo, but you need to tie all this together, right? So I'm not necessarily expecting an asset owner to go into Eric's platform. I'm not expecting an asset owner to maybe dive into the SBOMs and SPDXs. Like that's not reasonable unless you're maybe a top 10, a 10x employee, well, unicorn. But this is just an excerpt of a dashboard. I'm happy I have a PDF copy of it, and it is a bit. We are pre-production on this, so do mind a little bit of it. But if you look here on the left-hand side, we're looking at the vulnerabilities as disclosed through the NVD and CVE industry standard mechanisms, right? Everyone does enumeration by CPEs, or maybe they add some secret sauce, quote unquote, but I don't know if that's really true. There's no way to really do a bake-off. But if I were to look at this, I would say, oh, well, that looks pretty hectic, and there's only probably about 50 assets in that one particular table. Now, on the other side, I have a Windows 7 box. It's out of date. I expect to find a whole bunch of stuff, right? That's a no-brainer. But when you look at things, we added just a few pieces of OT software, like commodity software on top, right? They might add an Adobe onto it, which in almost every installer from most of the vendors, there is an Adobe Acrobat component in it. And that adds another 25 known CVEs. Okay, well, that's fine. But what about all of the other stuff that Eric and I are talking about? What about those Microsoft components that often get actually missed by CPE enumeration as well? Well, if we just look at the Windows 7 host that I'm talking about and compare it to the before and after, what we did was we took a Windows 7 plain Jane installation with a administrative user, nothing fancy, just like every other OEM and integrator does. And then I added all of the OT software, and there's only about 4 packages here from ABB, and also I think there was one from OSIsoft, and all of a sudden I have another 152 vulnerabilities on top of my 920 approximately. Now that's kind of terrifying when I'm thinking of that from a NERCSIP perspective, where I have something like, Eric, quote me if I'm wrong, but it was like 45 or 90 days to get all of my vulnerabilities up to date, regardless of whether or not I have an agreement with a vendor. So that's another aspect to it. So and then the other thing here is that there's a way to enumerate. So let's say I have an installer, right? That SAB 600 or that Rockwell RS Logix installer. That's going to install a whole slew of products. You're going to have, in this case, you have a license manager, which Eric and I both were laughing at, that it is another historian type exercise. You don't want to necessarily dive into what's an Aladdin, what's SafeKey. That's just part of it. You probably don't want to do the same for VxWorks or for a Linux RTU, right? There's so much stuff inside of it. Now, that's just to give you an outlier of what that looks like from a commodity IT-based system with OT products on top of it. But let's dive into some of the embedded ones. Well, if I took that matrix of the Rockwell the Power series in Urgent 11 or Urgent 20, no, sorry, the Trek Stack vulnerabilities, too many branded vulnerabilities here. If I would have looked just at those assets alone, and I'm using a real data set here from a pharma customer of ours, and this is across roughly 4 sites. They have 179 drives that fit the descriptions that were in that PDF. 32 of those would have been missed altogether just for that set of vulnerabilities alone, because they weren't being recognized by NVD properly. And so you would have missed all of that. So at least you can get a really good idea here. Now, I recognize also, again, that most asset owners will say, well, what, I can't do anything about an embedded product because of X. Well, potentially that's true. Remediation is a whole other ballgame altogether. So I'm ignoring it for the moment. But what this allows you to do, putting all those pieces together, is you as a human being don't have to waste extra efforts. You can reduce the amount of risk by human error and missing things. I mean, I go blind after looking at vulnerabilities for 30 minutes. So I can't imagine spending whole days at it. You're going to make more and more errors as the day progresses, or you're going to miss things if you don't know all of the history behind certain products. But what this allows you to do is to build a heat map, so you know which ones might be exposed. There's other things you can do apply within the Verve platform, which is add criticality or risk exposure scores with a number of means or by site. And you can build remediation campaigns, or you can find out, okay, well, my risky assets are here, and I know that PLC could be used for controlling a simpler relay, but it also might be a safety shutoff over there, even though it's the same product. So what I can do is I can then build a heat map, and even though these might all look the same, I can start to apply 62443 standards and do zones and conduits and all the other stuff. So this is just a way to get an idea of how things are going, and maybe even potentially even to divest a site if it's too risky for your own risk appetite. So that's kind of in a nutshell how it is. So to kind of wrap this up, and we're going to have 15 minutes approximately for questions, there's 3 main takeaways I want everyone to hear, and this is not to be a shameless plug for either one of us. This is from an asset owner's perspective here. Traditionally, IT vulnerability management systems miss most of the OT vulnerabilities. Even some of the OT designated ones will probably miss most of those vulnerabilities because they're not tying in all this extra data. So historically, these environments are different. And to manage them effectively, you need something that is aware, but also built for those OT solutions or those OT environments. Then you need the OT focus part that provides the true coverage and enablement. If I have a limited workforce, I need to get as much as I can out of those individuals. Or if I have even a product vendor, I need to get as much as possible out of that. Or if you're a services company, you'll want to do the same. So what you need to do is get all that accurate information in one place and allow people to take the right actions on it. But to do that, you need all that historical knowledge, and that spans decades. I don't expect a fresh grad out of school to figure this out. I don't expect even a person maybe with 4 or 5 years of industry experience to figure this out. This is a lifelong learning process. So to do that, and to do it safely, you need all of those pieces together, at least in a cohesive way. Now, there's a one thing between mapping assets and vulnerabilities to another, and that's what the aDolus partnership is about. But it requires context and nuance. And an asset owner is the only person that can really do some of that, right? They know where that PLC is being used. I can't know that. I could take sometimes an educated guess. If I saw a guard Logix versus just a regular logic, I could make a better assessment. But This allows asset owners to tie all that together and manage their risks in a cohesive view. And I think that is really, really powerful, especially when many organizations are just looking at a very simple CMDB or an Excel sheet. This is the real claim to fame here. And you can do that without actively scanning your assets, like in a port scanning manner that the IT systems would do. This is still safe for OT environments, the way that Verve does it. Now, it's not a pitch, but I'm happy to engage with a demo in that regard. Now, oh, my last slide doesn't seem to be going for some reason. I'll try to reload it. Okay, well, I'll happily put out our contact information. Maybe I'll pass it over to Eric so he can get that over there. But let's open the floor.
Should we do some questions? All right.
Yeah.
Here, let me. I can probably display that slide for you there, Ron. And oops, here we go. And there we go. And while we're at that, while I'm putting this slide up here for everybody to see, we might as well answer a few questions right here. And I see some great questions out there. I'm going to tackle a few right off the start, and then Ron, you want to jump in and take a few. We're not going to get through all these. They're just piling in here. So the first question, though, I'd love to take is one from Mike. And does the tool provide a way to tag or mark or make specific notes on specific findings that indicate review or remediation status or requirements? Not all implementations of technologies, even with identified vulnerabilities, cause the product or implementation to be vulnerable. You're right on, Michael, you nailed it. So yes, something I haven't shown anybody today is there's a whole tool set for vendors to be able to basically tune the recommendations we're making and say, yes, this applies, no, this doesn't apply. And so that's why we really like working directly with the vendors like OSIsoft, so that they can go in and say, oh yeah, you found a vulnerability in our product, it's real, or no, it isn't, and then can put a mitigation reasons behind that. So there's a whole tool set that I haven't shown you around flagging and vulnerability management. All right, Ron, do you want to tackle a question there?
Sure, there's a lot here. I don't know, which one do I want to choose? They're all great. Well, I can maybe get two and maybe, or three actually, and I think in a single stone here. So George has a question here about how do you detect vulnerabilities on firmware and OT devices like a PLC, and simultaneously, how can you process the firmware software for all vendors? And I think there's a related one here. I would still need to rely on my vendor, and that was from James here. And do I need to rely on their primary software update? Well, we're not quite talking about remediation here, but yeah. So the answer to all this is yes, you can process firmware within the aDolus platform. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily it's always going to be correct, and there's also certain cases where you can't do so. So, for example, if your firmware is encrypted, that requires probably a partnership between the vendor and aDolus. Now, I can't answer for Eric necessarily on that, but that is what I suspect to be the truth. Now, the other piece, though, is can you detect firmware on all OT devices? Well, in many cases, this isn't like your regular Linux boxes. These aren't these type of things. These are what's called generally they're MCU and FPGA built. MCUs are a very, very different story than your typical systems because they're real-time operating systems, or ITOSs. And so you can map out vulnerabilities on them, but they're a little bit trickier to find because VxWorks will hide everything behind a closed door. Vendors will go buy that piece of software and tie stuff in. So you have to do a bit of correlations there, hence why the Trek stack of vulnerabilities is a bit harder for people to figure out. You don't just go get a shell and ask, hey, what do you have on board? What did you compile in? No, it's a bit more than that. But what we're trying to do is to at least make an accurate representation of that based on multiple sources, reading build notes, looking at portals, and Eric was putting all that in one place. And then that gets ultimately reflected on the Verve platform so you can use it. So that kind of answers that aspect. Now, what can I do about, I still need to rely on my vendor? Yes, that's generally true. So there's a clause in the Linux GPL licensing called TiVoization. And for those of you who remember the little TiVo boxes, they might have provided you the source that was open, like the code that was open source, but guess what? You can't compile it and put it on the box. You'd have to lift the chip and reflow it if you could even figure it all out. So yes, you are still reliant on your vendor, but the idea there is you still need to look at all these things, manage if there is a firmware update, go through the MOC process, or you need to engage in compensating controls to protect those assets. Now, most of the time people think, oh my gosh, I have all these issues in one PLC. Yes, that might be true, but you're actually in a very defensible position, I would say, in OT. You own the plant, you control the persons there. You probably all of the cables are inside of a steel conduit. So you're very lucky in comparison to IT boxes where everyone is running around with their laptop and changing stuff, right? This is a very different environment. So what you would do is then maybe focus on the components that you can control more likely, which would be like the Windows box, the HMI above it. And so you lock that box down to prevent access to those systems, and you lock the PLC cabinet. Then you engage in other controls like, shameless plug again, using a Tofino. So there's a bunch of ways that you can get around those things. But to answer the original questions, yes, we can detect vulnerabilities in OT firmware. Maybe not novel 0 days, of course, because that requires, for example, a lot of understanding about the business logic that's inside of those systems, or the logic that's inside of the FPGA. But yes, there is ways to do so, and Eric will jump on
yeah,
that.
Ron, let me jump in on this one. I want to be really clear here that the best possible path is when we're working with the vendors. That's the ideal happy path for us, and the vendors that we've been working with have been phenomenal. We're really trying to help them help you. So yeah, you're not going to be recompiling the code, but it'll give you the ability to know that you have to go back and talk to that vendor, or even go see that they may have patched it. I mean, that ABB vulnerability that I showed you earlier, most people are just simply not aware of it. There's actually patches for it that ABB has shipped, done a good job of it. So sometimes it's just a matter of being able to know what to go look for. But even better is if the vendors can get involved, and we're happy to share these tools with the vendors. Ron, what do you think? There's one other question here that I saw that was a very simple question. Can we access a recording later? Yes, the answer is yes. You will be able to give you the recordings. And then there's another question from Amir that it says, just a naive question, but I'm going to ask, would this be able to process PCAP files to drive insights? And actually, that's not a naive question. We're working with a large telco right now to use basically traffic captures to be able to see what files are being transferred around on the plant floor. And then we can then analyze and detect those files, and then make the call back into the database to see if there's any CVEs. So it's absolutely possible. It's still a work in progress, but that's one of the things we're absolutely working on hard, is to be able to detect files, not just sitting there, but files in motion. It's definitely doable.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll add a little piece on there too. I mean, that comes back, there's lots of research on this. Eric and I ran the S4 detection challenges, and that all kind of fits into that same thing. What would you see, and would you see it at all? There's several problems there with this strategy, right? If you see packets being put over the wire, you might see that it's a Windows box, and it might be of a particular, I don't know, era, right? It's a Windows 10 or Windows 7, or maybe there's a shared Microsoft kernel between them, but you won't know what's running on them unless they're communicating. And that's the real problem, is that most of those vulnerabilities are on there. So if you take an average Windows piece of software and you say, okay, well, I have it from X vendor. Well, it actually has .NET library this, it has SQL server that. You won't get all of that by just looking at stuff on the wire. And you won't know anything about the configurations. You won't know probably anything about the users and how they're configured. So to be fair, you can do a very, very elementary aspect of this, but that's probably a capability you would add after you have everything else.
Yeah.
From an asset owner
we're
perspective.
seeing people sort of try and do this as sort of a belt and suspenders. I want to know what's on my machines, and I want to know what's going to my machines. Are there new packages? Yeah, are there new packages? Shall we tackle another question, Ron? I see a good one from Andrew here that I'd love to jump on. Andrew asks, how focused is aDolus's SBOM analysis on automation and ICS? On what other markets are easily covered? We've designed the system to work on any embedded platform or any software used in mission critical systems. So medical devices, building automation, anything like that, it'll work. It's very, very platform operating system. It's totally platform and operating system agnostic. I honestly can say we've worked mostly with automation and ICS vendors to enrich the data set, so we've got more data there. But anybody out there who would like to use it for medical devices or aerospace, it's absolutely, it can do that without any question.
Great. And I'm going to take Ryan's question, then I'll pass off Rob's question to you, Eric, after that. And
Yeah,
Ryan's
sure.
question, I swear this is a journalist question. Do you worry that this will cause issues in the short term because of the exposure of all the underlying components will allow very specific targeted attacks, specifically for smaller companies who don't have security plans? Yes, that's probably very true. I mean, if you look at the tiers of vendors, some of the top tiers are doing a great job, and some are not doing such a good job, and probably everything below that is falling off the face of the planet, unless there may be a new company that focuses on security. But having said that, so long term, yes, you say this is a huge benefit for the industry as a whole, but yeah, there is short term risks. I would argue maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I mean, if you look at most vulnerabilities that ransomware takes advantage of, they're all commodity vulnerabilities that have been out for over a year for the most part, and they rely on misconfigurations by asset owners. Like people are missing the basics. So I would say yes, maybe it could be used to weaponize, weaponize something, but the reality is that if people are targeting you with such kind of trivial vulnerabilities related to like a .NET 3.5 that's over 3-4 years old, you have bigger things to worry about. That's how I look at it, right? Like I can walk in with a USB stick, or hey, guess what? Everybody's working from home right now, and they're using their work laptop for everything, including Netflix and other things. So I am more concerned about other aspects getting into your environment than someone weaponizing a CVE like for libsharp. The other thing is, just because a CVE is noted there, you don't know necessarily the risk exposure for it. So let's say, for example, in this case, that libsharp was used for compressing files that were being used for diagnostic purposes. It doesn't ingest them. So if I'm, and I'm making this up a little bit as I go, but let's say I'm ABC customer and I'm using that OSI package, and I'm able to do a diagnostic zip of all of the stuff that I need to go for tech support. So I execute some functionality, I zip up the file, and then I email it to the vendor. Well, there's no attack path in unless you're on that local box. But if you're on that local box, I have way worse things to worry about. So I don't see it necessarily the same way. Now, maybe on an embedded side of things, but your PLC should never be on the internet. I mean, if you go even back to ISA 95, which is quite some decades old now, your asset should never be talking to the internet. Even remote access systems are not supposed to be able to directly talk to those PLCs. So if you're doing the basics right, this isn't really a bigger problem for you. All it's helping you do is to get a good grip on your risk register and be able to deal with issues.
Yeah. And I think we got time for one last question, then we're going to have to wrap up, Ron. And we'll try and answer all the questions we didn't answer online over the next few days. Really appreciate this, but I've got time. What do you think? One last question. And I've got a question here from Rob. Some vendors are easy in specifying vulnerable products, like all PLCs in this family are affected, but where does the knowledge come from of which PLC types in the family at the moment of publication? And then if a year later the family may have grown, are the new ones that may not have the vulnerability? Great question. So exactly like I showed you for doing name analysis, we're doing the same thing with product line analysis and product name analysis. And this is why you really need the machine learning components, is what we're trying to do is take the name of the vendor, the name of the product, the version numbers, and try and get a confidence level that that vulnerability may apply to a particular software or firmware bundle. So if a new firmware bundle comes out, we can look at it and say, okay, yes, it's got all the same components, but the versions have changed on these components, therefore they're no longer affected by the vulnerability. Or no, those components that had the vulnerability a year ago are exactly the same components this year. So you absolutely have to look at it not as a whole product, but at all the components and see what are the subcomponents and have they changed and will they have inherited old vulnerabilities or not. We actually do that automatically. You probably saw that when I showed the vulnerability that was with the SafeNet, and you can see that we'll try and look across other products to find identical components in use. So we're always trying to do component analysis both comparing two similar components and then also with all the metadata that surrounds a component. Well, Ron, what do you think? I think we're over time here. I think we need to wrap up. What do you think?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I guess I don't want to leave the audience with more problems than solutions. So we've talked about the problems. Eric's part of the solution, right? Eric's not the end solution, but he's part of the solution, depending on which side of the fence you're on. So if you're a vendor or an OEM, you're going to probably talk to Eric. Or if you're an asset owner, you're probably going to talk to people like myself. And between both of those, if you're an asset owner, that will be the right solution. You don't want to have to go jump through extra steps. You want all that in one place. So if you're already a Verve customer, that's great for you. We can find a way to get all this into your environment. And if not, well, if you're not a Verve customer and you're going to be a Verve customer, then we can also tie that together. Now, my object's not to be sales, but we'll be happy to answer all these questions in depth over maybe one or two blogs, or keep firing them at us, and we'll figure out a way to get out the message.
Yep. Yeah, thanks. So again, we're not trying to give you the bad news. What we're trying to say is, hey, there's a way to sort this out. We've got hidden vulnerabilities. The bad guys know where they are. The bad guys put them in there. The bad guys do all sorts of stuff. We just need to get our hand around it, get this wrapped up, and we're happy to work with vendors. Ron's happy, and his team are happy to work with asset owners, and really get the subcomponent vulnerability problem under control. And the first way we're going to do that is to start to know where they are and be able to understand what we're dealing with. So hope you enjoyed today's talk, and I think we'll wrap it up